Alright, in this lecture, let's create Elastic Query Service, which is the fourth microservice that I will create. I will start adding dependencies. I will add app-config data, Elastic config, Elastic Query Client, and for this one I need to add the version to the base PAM XML file. I will use project.version property for that. Then I will add Spring Boot Starter Web dependency, which is required to develop a web application. Then I will add the Spring Cloud Starter Config dependency, and then the Spring Boot Starter Security and Spring Boot Starter Test dependencies. I will use this Starter Test dependency to write a simple test. I will then add Elastic Query Application main class. Elastic Query Service Application. As usual, I will use the Spring Boot Application annotation to make this class a Spring Boot Starter class. And then I will use component scan annotation to set the base packages property as com microservices demo. I will then call the Spring Application run method in the static void main method. Then I will add application YAML configuration file. But again, I will use config server for the configuration, so I will leave this application YAML file as empty. I already created a config file for this in the config server repository. So let's update it with the version and server servlet context path properties. This server servlet context path property is required to set a context path for a web application. I will set it as Elastic Query Service here. Then let's go to app-config data module and create Elastic Query Service config data class. I will use Elastic Query Service prefix. And add a single property, private string version here. As you see, I used configuration properties annotation to set the prefix Elastic Query Service. Then I also need to add bootstrap YAML file with the config server properties. I will create bootstrap YAML file in the resources folder of Elastic Query Service. You can copy the properties for this bootstrap YAML file from one of the other services and simply replace application name, profiles active, and cloud config name. The profiles active must match with the configuration file that we have created in the config server repository. And then let's add the logback XML file using common logback as we did previously for other microservices, and just replace the variables dev_home and app_name, which are the specific properties for this logback XML file. And finally, let's add a simple context load test, which will run with the maven install command. I will create Elastic Query Service Application test class under the test Java folder and add Spring Boot test annotation. For this service, there is no initialization logic, as was in the Twitter to Kafka or Kafka to Elastic services. So a context load test can run without any dependency here when we run the maven install command. I will add context loads method with test annotation. So when I run the maven install command, this test class will start a Spring context for me. So I will be sure that the Spring context started without an error. Please note that this microservice will be used as the query components in CQRS pattern. Remember that The events that hold the streaming data are created on Kafka topics in the Twitter to Kafka service. And then I have moved the data to Elasticsearch using Kafka to Elasticsearch microservice. And finally, here I will query this data from Elasticsearch, completing the CQRS architecture. Separating write and read parts allows me build command and query parts separately using the correct technology and do the operations effectively, like using the Elasticsearch for querying the data. And as I mentioned previously, this will lead to an eventual consistency instead of a strong consistency, because there will be a small delay between the write and read operations. But this is not that important if you don't do real-time operations, and having write and read components separately will allow you to implement and use the different parts much more effectively. In the next lecture, we will start creating a web controller. So I will see you in the next lecture.